be talking about Atlantis, the lost continent, and specifically evaluating the claim made by Peter Doherty in his book Atlantis, the Silver City. Facts we know from Atlantis come from one source, and that is the ancient Greek philosopher of Plato. All of our claims that we're going to be evaluating are going to be compared to the facts that come from this original source from Plato. And here on the slide are listed an overview of the facts that we know according to Plato of what Atlantis looked like and what the civilization had and how it was destroyed. A quote from Plato's dialogue to Timaeus, where he is beginning to describe Atlantis and how it came to be. We're going to look at Peter Doherty's claim in his book published called Atlantis and the Silver City. He also has done made numerous appearances on TV shows on the History Channel, where he has claimed to found Atlantis in the city of Silves, Portugal, specifically the center of the ancient civilization resides in Silves, Portugal. So today we're going to look through his claims and see whether or not this is a plausible explanation. First, let's explore specifically what Peter Doherty claims about this location. So first and foremost, he claims that Atlantis is located on the Iberian Peninsula, where Spain and Portugal reside, and that the center of Atlantis, the center city, was in Silves, Portugal. He claims to have used 60 of Plato's clues, which Plato left in Critias and Timaeus, the dialogues, and he says that these, out of 100 clues, there are 60 that still remain to be used today, and he used all 60 of these clues to lead him to believe that this is the center of the ancient civilization. One of his main driving forces behind this site is that he claims that instead of using the translation for the Greek word nasos, for meaning island, we should translate it to mean peninsula. And so that's how we came to the conclusion that if we translate nasos to mean peninsula, that Plato was really talking about the Iberian Peninsula right above the Strait of Gibraltar. And that, that is where we can look back and see that that does line up with where Plato was describing the civilization to have been. So let's go through and talk about these claims. On our Runnels lie detector, we're going to ask ourselves, where is the claim being presented? First, we know that Atlantis and the Silver City, the book, was published by a company called Loom Books. This publishing company was previously known as Endeavor Media, where they have been known for publishing thriller novels, crime fiction, historical fiction, biographies, history, and other science fiction publications. It was founded by Matthew Lynn, who is described as a British thriller writer. So really the bottom line from this slide is this claim was not published in a peer-reviewed or academic journal, and it was not subjected to the rigor of, peer criticism and looking at it through the academic lens that one does when needed to publish in an academic or reviewed journal. So that's the first kind of red flag that we see here is this book is being published by a company that has been known to publish entertainment as opposed to scholarly articles. For to think of is going to be who is making this claim. So let's talk a little bit about who is Peter Doherty. First, Peter Doherty is a writer. He's a British writer. He was a former publisher and advertising manager, and he has been researching Atlantis independently for over 20 years. Having said that, it seems that he has no formal education in archaeology, classics, nor geography. This is another red flag, nothing wrong with being a publisher and a writer, but in order to be making the types of claims about the evidence that he is presenting, we need to have some level of education, some formal education, formal training to back up what he is claiming. So that's another red flag. We will see if he takes it upon himself to consult experts in the field, but he himself does not have training in the field that he is writing about. Where the claim is being published, who is making the claim. Let's ask a little bit more about how does Peter Doherty know what he is writing about. So Peter claims that he did a very close reading of the dialogue of Critias and Timaeus, and he identified 100 clues from Plato that can be used to determine the location of Atlantis. But he states that 60 of them are what he used due to the fact that I guess the other 40 are no longer present in society for whatever reason. So he highlighted 60 clues, specifically from Plato's words, that can be used to identify the location of Atlantis. And this is how he came to the conclusion, was directly from the writings of Plato, which is a good sign because we know that Plato is the one and only original source of Atlantis. Anyone who has spoken of Atlantis since then has always referenced Plato. There has never been an independent source separate from Plato to describe Atlantis. So it is good that Doherty is using the facts, so to speak, from Plato. We know that Doherty himself is not an expert in the field, and it would be important for him to consult experts. So that's our next question. Did he consult experts during his journey to come to this conclusion? One so-called expert that Peter Doherty claims to collaborate with is Dr. Richard Freund. Dr. Richard Freund is a, professor and archaeologist. He is known for investigating the metal bars found in Gela, Sicily, and these metal bars were found from a shipwreck underwater. And using X-ray fluorescence, they did an analysis of the composition of the metal bars, and they claimed to be a mix of metals, copper, lead, tin, which apparently matched the description of the mystery metal that Plato described Atlantis having, orichalcum. So this is very interesting, and this was used to back Doherty's claim about this being the general area of Atlantis. So, when we learn a little bit more about Dr. Richard Freund, he is a professor of Jewish studies at Christopher Newport University in Virginia. His PhD is in philosophies of Judaism, and his research is in the archaeology of the Holocaust. So, while very well educated and interesting research that he has done, again, his background is not in Atlantis. He does not have a background in geology or, archaeology. His PhD is in philosophy. So he's not the best, most well qualified expert to be consulting on this type of manner. Okay, so finally, we're going to talk about what is the evidence that Daughtry is presenting. So we know his claims that Silvas, Portugal, is the site of Atlantis. And how does he back this up? What evidence does he present to, back up this claim? Let's talk about it. Talked about the first two claims that Atlantis is located on the Iberian Peninsula and the center was in Silvas, Portugal. This is what Daughtry claims, and he says that we should translate Nasos, the Greek word, to mean peninsula, not island. And that's how we come to the conclusion that Plato was talking about a peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, as opposed to an island in the Atlantic Ocean. So, what is the evidence to back this up? So, in reading Plato's dialogues, Daughtry came across where Plato mentions that the city was rich in chestnuts and was a city of great wealth. Well, Silvas, Portugal, is rich in chestnuts and does have precious metals that are mined from this region. Furthermore, Silvas is located 9.25 kilometers upriver from the Mediterranean Sea, and this aligns with the statement made by Plato that the center of the city was 9.25 kilometers from the sea. Furthermore, Plato states that the city had buildings made of red, white, and black stone, and Silvas, Portugal, has white, red, and black pavements that can be seen throughout the city. Finally, Daughtry claims that the old castle, the Silvas Castle, which resides on a mound or a tall hill in the center of the city, has the same exact land measurements as the central temple to Poseidon that Plato describes in his dialogue. We can see the world map, and in the center there is a little pin where the Strait of Gibraltar is located, and right below the Iberian Peninsula. So this is the location that Peter Daughtry claims is the site of Atlantis. Heard what Peter Daughtry, his claim is and what his evidence is to support this claim. Let's break this down and organize it a little bit. So, the problem that many have asked throughout history is, did Atlantis exist? And if yes, where was it? And how and why did it disappear? Peter Daughtry claims his primary hypotheses are, yes, Atlantis existed, and it was not located on an island, but rather on the Iberian Peninsula, and the center of the civilization was Silvas, Portugal. He also claims that the city clearly was not destroyed. It was just forgotten because it still remains today. From these, we can assume some secondary hypotheses. So he assumes that the Silvas castle on the hill was the site of the temple to Poseidon. From this, we can also conclude that Atlantis was an advanced society with many riches, and that archaeologists have been looking in the wrong place all along. We shouldn't have been looking in the Atlantic Ocean. We should have been looking right above the Strait of Gibraltar. And then he presents the evidence that we just talked about. After looking through all this evidence, one might ask themselves, there has to be a simpler explanation for that. And that's where Occam's razor comes in. So Occam's razor states that there must be a simpler explanation with less assumptions. So in this case, that would be that Atlantis was just a story made up by Plato, as he was a philosopher and liked to think about humanity, and the story represents humanity and the faults, human faults. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later and how many scholars think that this myth, that it was a myth, and Plato was exploring some philosophical ideas and some political views during his time period. So before we talk about the Occam's razor and the simpler explanation, let's evaluate some of Daughtry's evidence a little bit. So his claim is really backed on the fact that we should be translating the Greek word nasos that Plato uses, and we should be translating it to mean peninsula, not island. So after some cross-reference of a few different dictionaries, Greek dictionaries, there is no, I was not able to find any source that gave peninsula as an appropriate translation for this word. They all talk about it meaning to swim or meaning isle, floating land, island. So this is going to be hard for Daugherty, I think, to defend. This is kind of what his claim is based on, that we were misinterpreting his words, and we shouldn't have been looking in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean for an island. We should have just been looking for the peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula. But since it doesn't really seem like this Greek word nasos can mean peninsula, his argument right now is starting to break apart a little bit. So let's evaluate some more of his evidence. Daugherty also claims that the site of the temple to Poseidon, the center temple of the city, is located on the mound where the current Silves castle sits. He claims that it has the same land measurements as described in Plato's dialogue. So if we do a little bit of research about the history of the Silves castle, we learned that there was evidence of Islamic ceramics found there that were dated to be between the 8th and 13th century BCE, so about 200 or so BCE at the earliest. According to Plato, Atlantis existed around 360 BCE. So these dates are kind of conflicting. If it's true, then that would mean that the current Silves castle and the Temple of Poseidon would have existed at the same time in this same place. So we haven't excavated. There has been no excavation of this castle, but again, here we see Daugherty's claim starting to fall apart with the evidence not adding up. That Daugherty puts out as his evidence is he cites Plato's writings in where he mentions how Atlantis was rich in chestnuts, and Daugherty goes on to explain how this region of Portugal, in Silves, Portugal, is very rich in chestnuts, and that's how he justifies another piece of evidence of why this must be the location of Atlantis. So when we dig a little bit deeper into this claim, this piece of evidence, and we look into the history and the origin of chestnuts, we find that chestnuts originated in Asia, and they first arrived into the ancient Greeks about 3,000 years ago from Asia. And it is then believed that it wasn't until the Romans who extended the cultivation of chestnuts throughout the rest of Europe. So while it is possible that, the people of Atlantis could have also obtained chestnuts from Asia, based on different evidence, we understand that while there may be chestnuts in Silves, Portugal now, it's not likely that there were chestnuts before the Greeks in Portugal. It seems that chestnuts didn't arrive into Europe until after the Romans, which would be several thousand years later. So again, some of Daughtry's evidence that he is leaning on is not as sound as it should be. Now that we have evaluated and, sort of debunked some of the evidence that Daughtry presents, now we want to consider some negative evidence. So the negative evidence shows us, if this was such a powerful, wealthy civilization who had, great riches and technology that they claim, how come we have not found any tools or artifacts remaining in this site? Daughtry has not come forward with any sorts of artifacts that would show that this is the site of Atlantis or that this was the site of an ancient advanced civilization. And furthermore, if he's claiming that Silves, Portugal was just the center of this great civilization, why is it that we haven't found any other artifacts or physical evidence in the surrounding, miles in Europe, since Plato described this to be, expansive, and if this was the center, then we would expect to find possibly other artifacts outside of the city center, but that also has not been found. So in considering the negative evidence and thinking of how Daughtry's evidence that he has presented is falling short, we're coming to the conclusion that this might not be the site of Atlantis, and that Daughtry has not done enough to convince us that this was Atlantis. So now we look to Occam's razor to tell us and to try and make sense of this story that Plato tells so explicitly and in great, great detail. What would be another explanation for why he would talk about this great civilization? Well, many scholars have thought about this, and I too came to this conclusion, and then was, my thoughts were confirmed by other scholars as well in peer-reviewed journals, and essentially the opposing view to the view that there actually was a physical Atlantis, the opposing view to that, the Occam's razor explanation, is that this was simply just a story that Plato made up and that he wrote. And as he did, he was a philosopher and liked to, explore humanity and talk about politics and talk about the issues occurring in his time. And so many scholars think that this story of Atlantis is Plato's utopia, his ideal, he created the ideal world for what his political views and his lifestyle. And so not only is this, his utopia of what the world should be, but it is also a criticism of Athens at the time, Athens, Greece. He had a lot of strong political views, and those are reflected in the story of Plato. There's many similarities through Atlantis and Athens and the structure of the government and some of the political powers and the disagreements happening. And many scholars who have studied his work think that he is using Atlantis to kind of describe what might happen to Athens if they didn't change, what was going on at the time. And I think this would be a more reasonable explanation. We have not had sufficient evidence to support the claim that Atlantis was a true place. Plato is the one and only source, one and only independent source that we have seen. And despite many excavations and many long years, there is still no consensus on where Atlantis might be, and Peter Daughtry's claim that it is in the Iberian Peninsula, also, since we've just gone through it, doesn't stand up to Occam's razor, the more simpler explanation for why this would happen. If we dissect a little deeper into Plato's writing of Critias and Timaeus and compare it with his later work, for example, in the Republic, we see a lot of similarities. We see the concept beginning of the noble lie, which Plato begins to describe in the Republic. But in Atlantis, we see this emerging. The noble lie was Plato's idea that in an ideal world, all citizens would be made of different precious metals. And this would be used to keep each class within society satisfied, so that there would not be uprising between the classes. And we see this in the Atlantis story that Plato tells. He explains how Atlantis was a civilization of demigods, half god, half human. And then over time, the Atlanteans became less and less godlike and more human, and that led to their demise. So we see a similarity in his train of thought, starting with Atlantis and then fully fledged out in the Republic. Furthermore, there are many similarities between Atlantis and Athens during the time. One of those being the uncertainty of Athens' maritime alliances. And Atlantis was Plato's solution. Atlantis was a powerful civilization who ruled the sea, the maritime sea, and had great alliances and trade. And some scholars think that Atlantis represents an idealized version of Athens, and that the demise of Atlantis would represent a battle between Atlantis and present-day Athens. And this was a symbol and a metaphor for the Persian Wars that were occurring. So there's a lot. This explanation makes more sense and has less hypotheses drawn from it, and it has more consensus across different scholars. In conclusion, unfortunately, Peter Daugherty does not present enough evidence to support his claim that Silves, Portugal is the site of Atlantis. His evidence is easily disputed and explained through other phenomena. Furthermore, the negative evidence, the lack of artifacts, the lack of remains in this area, also contribute to the undermining of his claim. And Occam's razor provides a simpler, more logical explanation that the myth of Atlantis was truly a myth, and Plato was using his philosophical mind to explain some political and ideological views that he had during his time. Thank you.